Art was never really my passion. I came into it not because I wanted to express myself, but because I like to tinker. It started off as a hobby. It became a side job to make a few extra bucks at craft shows, I guess, and what I do doesn't cost much to make. See, I mostly use what nature gives me. Oh, wait, no, I'm not talking about nude photography. I deal with a completely different kind of junk. I make sculptures out of driftwood. Or I guess I should say, up until a few weeks ago, I made sculptures out of driftwood. Sometimes hobbies come to a natural conclusion when life gets in the way. Other times you find yourself standing on the beach, almost pissing yourself with fear, and you realize, you know what? Maybe you're just not cut out for this. In my case, it was the latter. The night it happened, I was scouting out a new beach, impossible to reach by car, which I figured explained why no one else was there. Granted, most people don't go to the beach mid-November to begin with. Road or no road. I got my four-wheeler and trailer through the brush and onto the sand. It was peaceful, quiet. Small waves gently lapping up at the shore and the sun slowly descending towards the horizon. As far as driftwood goes, I'd hit the jackpot. I'd only made it a third of the way down the beach and had already filled my trailer. The only problem was, in my enthusiasm to pile on as much wood as I could, I'd worn myself out. It was time for a break and a meal. I jumped on my four-wheeler and I drove farther down the beach in search of a nice spot to watch the sunset, parking near the biggest piece of driftwood I'd ever laid eyes on. It looked like an overturned tree root splitting into two sections, both reaching into the sky. And touch your wrists together, tilt your head back, and that should give you an idea of what it looked like. The bark was clean and smooth, like it had been sandblasted to perfection. I sat on one of the larger branches, using the structure as my picnic table and throne. The thing never budged, buckled or cracked under my weight, solid as a goddamn brick. I knew I had to take it home with me, even if it meant dumping everything in my trailer to make room for it. It'd be worth it. I'd either build my largest, most spectacular sculpture yet, or I'd have enough wood to make hundreds of smaller ones. Either option was a win in my book. As I ate, I watched the ocean bathing in twilight. I smiled to myself, thinking these were the kinds of sights people paid to see. Here I was, experiencing them for free. The sun thinned and spread into a shimmering line, stretching across the horizon, blocked only by a single island a few thousand yards from shore. I finished off my last bite and I got back to work. I wasn't sure I'd be strong enough to drag the roots into my trailer alone, but I was going to try. I put my work gloves on, grabbed two thick branches, steadied myself, and yanked with all my might. Nothing. No movement whatsoever. I circled back to my trailer. The roots needed to be dug out, that's all. I reached through the branches I'd collected for the shovel at the bottom of my trailer, and then cursed as I sliced my arm open on a sharp stick. The cut wasn't bad enough to call it quits, but I wish I had gauze to keep sand from getting in. I pried my shovel free and stomped back to the tree roots, taking out my frustrations on the sand by violently scooping out shovelfuls like a dog digging up a bone. I expected to find the two halves of the roots converged into a trunk. But as I continued to dig, the space between them never diminished. A loud crack reverberated over the water, drawing my attention to the island in the near distance. The sound was followed by a few loud snaps as the silhouette of a tree came crashing down on the shore and rolled into the depths, forming a large ripple that spread and merged with the ocean waves. Without a doubt, that island had provided much, if not all, the driftwood I'd collected. In a few weeks, months, hell, maybe even years, the tree was probably going to wash up nearby and become the base of someone else's sculpture. My biggest mistake that night was not giving any thought to what made the tree fall. See, there are very few things that can take down a tree that size. And as I dug my shovel in the sand again, I felt the ground start to rumble beneath my feet. I realized an earthquake was one of the things. If it had hit the island first, then it had originated from the ocean. What's the one place you don't want to be in this kind of situation? The shore. You don't want to be on the shore because often ocean quakes are followed by tsunamis. I dropped my shovel and sprinted to my four-wheeler, but the quake intensified and I lost my footing, tripping on a small piece of driftwood. The sting of sand in my open wound made me scream into the night. I'm sure the water carried the sound far away to some poor schmuck out fishing who'd never know where the wail of a banshee had come from. As I tried getting back up, I felt something brushing against my leg. In panic, I jerked and looked behind me, letting out a little laugh as I realized that it was only driftwood that had rolled off my trailer in the shifting sands. More pieces fell and toppled around me, but there was no time to pick them up. I had to get to higher ground. I pushed myself to my feet and I brushed grains of sand off my arm, but I could still feel granules in my cut. Then, as though I had gotten sucked into a shitty slapstick comedy show, I tripped a second time and hit the side of the trailer, sending an avalanche of driftwood to pelt me. The mass was so heavy I could barely breathe. I felt like I was in the clutches of a boa constrictor. I swiped chunks of wood away from me and kicked my heels in the sand. And that's when things took a turn for the abnormal. The driftwood cracked and crunched, and I swear on my father's grave, it began moving on its own. The pieces weren't just tumbling from the motion of the perpetual earthquake. They were coiling around my legs to keep me in place. I did what any sensible person would do in my shoes. I lost my shit. I flailed, I screamed, and I might have cried a little, but nothing helped. The driftwood was climbing my legs and holding me down, God knows why. My feet were going numb, my cut was aching in pain, and I started feeling inexplicably weak to the point I couldn't lift my head anymore. To make matters worse, the earthquake was getting stronger. It ebbed and flowed as though the beach itself was breathing. From my angle, I saw my throne of driftwood being pushed skyward by something under the blanket of sand. Was this the epicenter? It couldn't be. If it was, then what happened to the tree on the island? As grains of sand cascaded off the growing mound, I started to see what was trying to tear itself from the ground. It was long, thick, and made of one of those millions of off-white painted colors you find at the hardware store. Maybe ivory, maybe eggshell. I'm not a paint expert, I couldn't tell you. There were deep cuts and grooves along the surface, some big enough to stick a whole person through. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at, probably because I'd never seen one so big before. But there was no mistaking that elongated snout and stretched, inverted, heart-shaped hole where its nose could have been. It was a deer skull. And what I thought were the roots of a tree were actually its antlers. Its jaw screeched in protest like rusted hinges as it slowly pried open its mouth and let out a loud roar. The driftwood, pinning me, suddenly snapped back and slithered away like snakes in the grass. I still couldn't move. I could only watch in terror as the beast tore itself from the ground like a weed plucked from a garden. It was immense. About as long as a school bus and as tall as the highest branches of an oak tree. In the hollows of its sockets were sizzling bright red embers that turned side to side as its head moved. A long, sticky tongue oozing with black drool could be seen between its chipped teeth. Whenever the deer opened its mouth, the tongue would roll out and hang limply over the side of its jaw. There was no flesh on its skull, but frayed patches of leather and tufts of fur clung to the rest of its skeleton. They hung from its ribs, back and neck, blowing like flags in the wind. Through the bones and the shrouds of skin, I could see its still beating heart, dangling in its chest, though I couldn't tell you what, if anything, it was pumping. Its muscles were gone, half its organs were missing, and its veins had collapsed and hung like tapeworms. It was a living, breathing nightmare, and it was staring me down with its literal, burning eyes. I don't have any money on me. What a stupid thing to say. The deer took a few steps towards me. I expected its footfalls to shake the ground in the same way it had when it emerged, but its feet hit the sand with a delicate weight of a feather. Its ember eyes cast their glow on me, making me feel like a deer in the headlights, and just beyond the brightness of its gaze, I could hear and see driftwood crinkling in the bushes. The branches surrounded us and seemed to watch eagerly like spectators at the Colosseum. Even if I'd been able to move and given a sword to fight, I wouldn't have stood a chance at a match against this gigantic undead beast. Best case scenario, I'd die quickly, impaled by its antlers. Worst case scenario, It used its disgusting rotted tongue to scrape my flesh away, bit by bit, like licking a salt cube. It bowed its head towards me, and I braced myself for what was sure to be a horrific death. I closed my eyes, took a final breath, and waited. I could feel the deer's hot, wet breath in my hair. I waited. He was sure taking his sweet-ass time, I thought. I waited. It was still just breathing on me. I waited. I couldn't hold my breath any longer. I gasped for air and opened my eyes, only to find its face inches from my own. Our eyes met. It huffed. The embers in its eyes grew and cast away the world around me. I was standing in the forest. There was something odd about my body. I could tell everything was there, but it didn't feel like I was in the right order, like someone had forced mismatched puzzle pieces together. I was parched. There was a pond up ahead, but something felt off about it. The trees around it looked dead. Their leaves had shriveled and turned brown, and their bark had broken off and lay scattered across the forest floor. My left ear twitched at the sound of a branch snapping under the weight of a squirrel. They came crashing to the ground. The squirrel survived the fall. It skittered to the water's edge, leaning in for a drink. I tried to scare it off, but it ignored my grunts. Something black and viscous slithered out of the water and wrapped itself around the squirrel. The rodent bucked and kicked for a few seconds, then went limp. I took a few steps back and watched as it decomposed before my very eyes, leaving nothing but a skeleton behind. The bones twitched and retreated into the forest. The dark tendril snapped towards me, and I quickly ran to the opposite direction. I could hear it slinking around the forest floor, trying to follow me, but I was fast and limber. I escaped across the sand bridge into the mainland. I was safe. For now. Time passed. I'm not sure how much time. The infection spread. When I craned my neck to look, I'd find the halo of withered trees around the pond had grown larger. One by one, the tree trunks eventually broke, sending a tidal wave of animals fleeing in fear. After a while, only birds were left to flee. Then even they disappeared. Something had to be done before it was too late. This was my land, and I was determined to protect it. In the past, I'd witnessed the destructive power of fire. For every tree and bush turned to ash, a new, stronger life grew in its place. Fire killed, fire cleansed, and fire purified. Maybe, I thought, maybe fire could end the plague. I waited for a storm. For lightning to strike the match, then pried a burning branch off a tree with my bare teeth. I ran as fast as I could across the sand bridge, careful not to extinguish the flame. This was my only chance to save my domain. The darkness was waiting for me in its forest of bones and decay. It had gotten bigger since we'd last met. It had grown almost as tall as me. Its size didn't matter. I had fire to fight it back. A creeping dread in my guts threatened to snuff out my courage, but I kicked off the ground regardless and tackled the darkness. Huffing as we both fell, it coiled itself around me like a snake as I swung the burning branch into its sticky mass. There was no pain, just the overwhelming need to give up and give in. I felt tired, but I fought the urge to let myself sink into exhaustion. I had the responsibility to protect my land. I couldn't let myself forget that. I used it as fuel to keep myself fighting through the quickly decaying body. The fire was working. The darkness was weakening, but so was I. We tussled some more. The flames spread quickly from one dead tree to the next. The darkness shriveled, twisted in agony, and disappeared into the pond. I thought I had won. I should have stayed behind to make sure my work was done, but instead, I retreated back to the mainland. I didn't want to die surrounded by flames and bones. I wanted to die near my forest. I had faith the raging fire would take care of whatever was left of the darkness. Limping, I trotted down the sand bridge back to the mainland. I could feel wind blowing through the gaps in my body and fire gnawing in my flesh. I collapsed on the beach. Feeling what was left of my life draining away, I looked back at the peninsula, and though I couldn't see the darkness through the sea of burning trees, I could feel its presence lingering. I had failed. With what was left of my strength, I pushed myself back to my feet and roared. If I couldn't kill it, I would at least stop it from spreading further. I reared back and stomped my hooves into the bridge. The sandy path collapsed into the ocean, turning the burning peninsula into a burning island. I surrendered myself to my fate, but death didn't come for me. I couldn't die. I'd become something else, more than just a guardian. I was now part of the darkness I'd fought. More me than it, but still it, connected like a peninsula to its mainland. When the fire died and the dust settled, a new forest grew on that island for the other me to feed off of. I knew I couldn't stop the darkness, but I could, and would, keep living my cursed half-life, protecting my lands from its tendrils. I can feel it in the driftwood. I could feel it in the bones of the unfortunate birds who land on the island. I can feel it in every one of its extensions. I will burn them all. I will not let it get beyond this shore. It is my duty to protect this land. I blinked. Embers sizzled in front of my eyes, the images faded like distant memories as the deer pulled away. I could move. I was already standing on 2 feet, though my legs were shaking. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. I didn't expect an answer, nor did I get one. The deer quietly turned its head and looked at the island. I followed its fiery gaze. If I squinted just right, you could see something moving through the trees, a kind of darkness silhouetted against the starry night sky. It's weird. I'm not even sure if I was seeing it or feeling it. I just knew it was there. The deer knelt in front of me. I was still put off by its appearance, but I felt safe. Safe enough not to flinch. "What do you need?" I asked. It huffed and jerked its head aside, showing me the burning eye rolling in its socket. Fire killed, fire cleansed, and fire purified. It wanted me to help burn the driftwood, I realized. The branches were still hiding outside the light, never too far nor too close. They were afraid of the deer, but not afraid to run. They wanted something. I'm bait, aren't I? The deer stood upright. I took that as a yes. I meandered to the water's edge and left the protective circle of light. The living driftwood slithered towards me immediately, crinkling and crackling as it moved across the sand. They came in a horde, piling on top of one another to be the first to reach me. I had my doubts the deer would rescue me. This seemed to be what it wanted me to do, but I had no reason to believe that I was supposed to make it out of here alive. I just had to trust that I would. The driftwood closed in on me, but before they were able to strike, I heard a growling hiss of fire. The branches shrieked as flames tore through them in an instant, leaving the demonic deer standing in the cinders, watching me. I turned around. Cool. Well, I'm gonna go home. Its long, bony snout nudged my shoulder. What more was I supposed to do? I'd played my part, right? The skeletal creature jerked its head towards the island. Oh, hell no, I murmured. Somehow I knew what it wanted without even being asked. It was a tall order, an order I didn't want to fill, and yet it's a little hard to say no to a giant undead deer that just saved your life from evil driftwood, you know? It wanted to finish what it started ages ago. But damned if I knew why it thought I'd be of any help. Its 4 legs buckled as it laid down as an invitation to climb on. I wasn't even sure how. I'd never ridden a horse, undead or otherwise, and it wasn't like the thing had a ladder. I hesitantly reached up for one of its patches of skin, gave it a good tug to make sure it would hold my weight, and then pulled myself onto its skeletal back. Sitting there was by no means comfortable. It was surprisingly stable. I held on tightly to the old, porous bones as the creature stood up and began trotting towards the ocean. It remembered exactly where the bridge had once been, and I think the ocean floor was still more elevated there than anywhere else. At its deepest points, the water reached the deer's upper neck and my chest. At its highest points, only my feet were submerged. It was a slow march to the island, which gave my anxiety plenty of time to build. Every step took minutes. Every time I looked back to check our progress, we'd barely moved. My mind started to wander, and in my head, I saw visions of the darkness clutching the roots of trees and draining the life out of it like sucking the flavor out of a slushie, leaving only ice, or in this case, dead wood behind. Somehow I could taste what those trees tasted like. They were sour and grainy. They were satiating, not satisfying. Now birds, on the other hand, birds were sweet and flavorful. But nothing was as flavorful as... The deer stopped at the water's edge, snapping me back to reality. I didn't want to get off, but I didn't have much choice. The deer knelt, and I slid down its head like a child at a park. "You sure I can't just..." It growled. I'm going, I said. It huffed a warm puff of air on me. I'm not sure if it was meant as encouragement or as a warning that it was growing impatient. Either way, I started walking towards the forest. You know, for an island supposedly home to a life-sucking monster, the greenery looked fairly healthy near the water's edge. Then again, if the darkness's food supply was limited, maybe it was keeping these plants and trees as a reserve. It could likely jump at the chance to eat me. It hadn't gotten something as big to feast on in decades. It still remembered the thirst-quenching exhilaration of larger mammals. If it had lips, it'd be licking them right now. As I ventured into the forest, I found a completely different landscape. Gone was the greenery, and in its place was death as far as the eye could see. There was nowhere my feet could fall, where bones wouldn't snap like twigs beneath them. Skeletons blanketed the forest floor like snow. I don't know how many hundreds, if not thousands of creatures had spent their final moments here. I prayed that I wouldn't join them. No one would ever be able to find my bones in this overflowing, exposed graveyard. I glanced back to plead with the deer, but it was gone. If I had the strength to swim back to shore, I would have tried, but I barely had enough energy to walk. I tried to be quiet and not draw attention to myself, but my footfalls were sloppy and loud, and my heart refused to lower its volume. It was just a matter of time before the darkness heard the dinner bell and came for its meal. Out of the corner of my eyes, I caught it moving through the trees. I froze, and I swallowed a knot in my throat. I don't think the word afraid really cuts it. I was a mouse who'd been spotted by an owl. I could try to hide, but it was already too late. It was going to take my life, and maybe in a few years my bones would wash up on shore like old driftwood. It was like oil, thick, dark with rainbow highlights reflecting off its surface as though it was simultaneously made of nothing and everything. As it trickled closer, I felt myself surrendering. I had nothing to defend myself against its single-minded determination. I could only stand there and resign myself to my fate. Just as a thick, hand-like tendril reached out to take me, the deer's bright glowing eyes appeared in the darkness as though out of nowhere. Its antlers ripped through the wilted trees, tearing into the mass of blackness. The bait. Right. I was the bait to draw the creature out of the pool. I don't know how I knew that's why I was needed. I just did. Something about the pond protected it, but if food came into its territory after so many years of chewing on scraps, it wouldn't resist the call. Somehow I understood all this. Somehow I felt the hunger, the burning desire to kill it, and the fear of my own death all rolled into one. The two fought as I stood on the sidelines, the darkness lashing the deer violently across the face, the deer pinning it down with its antlers. The embers in its eyes became flames. The flames jumped to the trees and engulfed the area. I couldn't breathe. Coughing, I ran to shore, trying not to inhale too much smoke as my vision started to blur. I remembered the crackle of the fire, the snapping of the tree trunks, and the growls of the deer as I lost consciousness. I woke up on the shores of the mainland, washed up like driftwood. The island had been burned to the ground. I don't know who won the fight. I went looking for the antlers in the sand, but never found them. I guess they're both gone. It's weird, though, because it's almost like I can still feel them both. Maybe it was another draw. God, I hope not. As for me, I don't make sculptures out of driftwood anymore. Too afraid I might stumble on a surviving branch from the island, and that I'd somehow help the darkness grow back. All I can do now is hope the fires did its job, and that the island is cleansed. The ashes should have fertilized the soil by now. It'll take a few years for the forest to regrow. It's only then that I'll know for sure.